Kia ora, ngā mihi nui ki koutou katoa, ina manahiri ngā hoa e whā, nau mai haere mai ki whanganui atara, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings everybody, welcome to Wellington for those who are visiting. I want to acknowledge my good friend Sir Eon Edgar who is here and who we owe much on many things, especially for today. Eon is always the boss, so thanks Eon for your support. Also, speaking of bosses, I want to acknowledge Jim Mann, who used to boss me around when I worked for the University of Otago, and it's actually really great to be back here at the med school where I did quite a bit of the work that I did. For those who don't know, prior to going into politics, I worked for the Research and Enterprise Office of the University of Otago, based up here in Wellington, and to show that the world is a very small place and that things always move in a circle. At the end of my talk, I'll tell you a little story that relates to a program in the budget and something that some of the people in this room might be very familiar with. I just wanted to start, Nikki, because I walked in at the end of that, just to say I didn't know that what had happened to the Healthy Eating Guide. So I just want to say thank you for the work that you've done, because I'm not a nutritionist or involved in this area of work, particularly on a day-to-day basis, but I know that it's been a really powerful publication. So can I just say thank you? It's on behalf of everybody for that. And in some senses, what I want to talk about today actually relates to a number of the themes that Nikki was picking up in the context of social media. I do have a friend who's a scientist who says that if the internet were a drug, it would have been heavily regulated. The thing is, it came in and everybody got excited about it, and now we're trying to retrofit the regulations around it. And as you can see with some of the things that the government is currently doing in terms of the Christchurch call and trying to deal with extremism online, just how hard it is to retrofit to something, a level of regulation, and social media is the extreme example of that. But the reason I mentioned that some of the themes are there is in terms of the wellbeing budget, and I'm sure you'll all be thrilled to know that the slide pack is not the whole budget or anything like that. It's some elements that I'm not even going to use all of the slides, but it's some elements of it that I wanted to talk about. But one of the big drivers behind the wellbeing budget concept at a philosophical level was actually to try and deal with the growth of populism and extremism. Because one of the things that I think has lain behind some of the political developments around the world, like Brexit, like the growth of populist leaders. You see, I'm a politician, so I'm not allowed to say the exact names of people sometimes, but the growth of populist leaders around the world is driven by the fact that people feel that politics, the business that I'm in, is something that is done to them, not something that they are part of. And I think when messages are delivered by politicians, globalization is great. It's caused all these amazing things to happen in our world, and you're sitting in a town in the north of England where you've lost your job and your families have lost their jobs. It's quite hard to marry those two things together. So when someone comes along with a populist cause that says, actually, I can solve that for you and there's someone to blame for it, you'll be instantly attracted to that kind of idea. And part of the idea of a wellbeing budget is to try and capture the values that people have about what is success and what should we be measuring and what should we be investing in ways that people actually feel. And the genesis of this immediately for us was in the 2017 election campaign, where, I don't know if you remember, but we were hearing from everybody that we had a rock star economy and our GDP growth rate going in was around about 3.5%. Way huge, great growth rate. But as I went through that election campaign in 2017, more often than not, I was saying, and what was being reflected back to me more importantly was, well, if we're such a rock star, why is child poverty growing? Why is homelessness growing and is now seen to be some of the worst per capita in the world? Why are we not able to swim in most of our rivers in summertime? How are we a rock star, or are we successful if we've got all of these things going on? Those actually, to my mind, are the values of New Zealanders, but we weren't reflecting them back in the way we put budgets together or the way we decided as governments what we did. So part of our motivation was actually to be able to say, if we're going to get people more engaged in politics, to believe more in democracy and what we're doing, we need to reflect more of the value set that is around us in it. So I just wanted, that was a very long segued introduction to say part of what motivated us to do what we're doing. But the core of what we're doing is around what the theme of this day is about, the symposium about, which is about the use of evidence. And it may come as a shock to people in the room, but not every budget that's been put together by the New Zealand government in its history has been all based on what evidence told you was the best thing to do. What has been described to me by some former ministers is that budgets have tended to be a bit like a contestable fund, really, and that ministers came up with bright ideas, pitched them up to the Minister of Finance. The Minister of Finance, in a relatively arbitrary way, said, I'll pick that one, and that one to keep the peace among my colleagues, and lo, a budget was created. That's not good enough, and it's a big part of what we're trying to change with the Wellbeing budget, and I'll describe a little bit more of the detail of that in a minute. But its key attributes are, firstly, working from the bottom of the slide up, trying to track our measures of success differently, to understand differently about what success might look like. So yeah, it's not just GDP, it is actually other things. Having a prosperous economy is important, but it is among a number of other parts of it. And the fundamental basis for it is a piece of work called the Living Standards Framework, which the New Zealand Treasury has actually been working on for some years, but it was only when our government came in that we picked it up and embedded it into the budget process. And without getting into a huge amount of detail about it, the Living Standards Framework is based on 4 capitals, those 4 capitals being financial, human, natural and social. And to pick up some of Nikki's points about keeping it simple, when I'm talking to non-economist audiences, that's the money, the people, the environment and our communities. And actually making sure that those 4 elements are kept in some form of balance. So essentially the framework has the stocks of our well-being, which are the capitals, which you'll see there, and the flows, which are the domains of our current well-being. And what you see there are 60 or so indicators that we have the data for, that we can track, that we can show over time how they evolve. And so between the 2 of them, that framework and a dashboard that's been drawn from that framework, which is all available online for you to have a look at, were the core of how we developed our first wellbeing budget. So first time out, needs a lot of work, huge data gaps. That's the first thing I'll tell you. Secondly, doesn't quite capture, in my opinion, who New Zealand really is. So there's a real gap around a Te Ao Māori view, around a Pacifica world view that we need to bring in more in terms of the way we do the indicators. But it's a start to being able to at least say we've got some evidence to track whether or not what we're doing is leading to improvements in people's lives. Sorry, I went too far. So I'll come back to some of those in a second, but that process of being able to track a broader measure of success is important. Lots of countries have done balanced scorecards and this sort of thing. The big difference with what we've done this time is not only are we using that information to track and measure our success, we use the evidence that we got from that to decide what to invest in. And so in setting the priorities for our budget, we went through and looked at what were the issues that we needed to focus on. And this is just a chart to show, there's a companion one I don't have with me today, which is basically just a line of that description I gave of the contestable fund type budget. This is to show you that it's a constantly reinforcing process of getting the evidence, developing proposals and projects to go with that, putting those through the budget process, testing and analysing and then coming back again. And so that idea of setting priorities, basing it on evidence and indeed on expert advice. So we didn't just use that framework and the research and the indicators and evidence from there. We also went out and tested with the government's network of science advisors whether or not we were on the right path. Were these the issues that were truly going to be able to improve New Zealanders' well-being. So we combine their advice, international studies, work done locally, and the framework to come up with our priorities for the budget. And nearly, those priorities are the ones that you see in red that run across the top there. So they were the priorities in this year's budget by evidence. And there's just an example of the evidence there. There's a whole huge set of information here which you can find. All the budget documents are online. Some people found them earlier than others this year. You'll be able to find them now too, and you'll see that under each of the priorities there's the evidence we used. And we turned that into something called New Zealand's Wellbeing Outlook. So a big shift in the budget documentation this year is traditionally there's been something called an economic and fiscal outlook. That's still there. You'll still find it, and it's got all the charts about debt and surpluses and government expenditure and unemployment rates and all of those things. But we've made that part now of an overall wellbeing outlook that looks at those other capitals and says, well, how are we going on those capitals? And actually, I'm not going to get into much of the substance of the budget today, but you will see there probably something that all of you will know, but as I'm talking to an audience of people, of scientific-minded people, actually testing it and proving it is important, and that is that overall, New Zealand's wellbeing's not too bad relative to a lot of other countries in the world, but there are some serious gaps in our wellbeing. Those are the ones, I mean, the top sort of 4 highlighted there that helped inform us in terms of where our focus around the budget should go. So, evidence-based, different measures of success. The third and critical element for me is the breaking down of silos and the working across government. And that's probably one of my messages, because always these events, it's always important to have a message for the people in the audience. The breaking down of silos doesn't just apply to government. It applies to all of you. To look beyond your particular area of focus and study and your lifelong work on an aspect of diabetes, and to be able to say, if you want to be a part of social change, working out how you take that message to a wider group, become part of a wider group of advocates for the kind of change that you're looking for. Inside government, we've got the responsibility to do that as well. And it staggers me, even now, after more than 20 years of knocking around the fringes of government, just how hardwired those silos of government are. And one of my ambitions in politics is to break them down. And so you do that from all ends. So few of you will have noticed, but this week we had the first reading of the Public Finance Act Wellbeing Amendment Bill, which inserts into the 30-year-old piece of legislation, alongside the importance of fiscal objectives, wellbeing objectives. So that means that every budget has to talk about wellbeing. That means that government agencies who look very closely at the legislation that governs their work now have that direction. That public finance is not just about fiscal indicators, it's actually about all of those areas that we've just been discussing. And the legislation also requires that government report on that. So that now starts, I hope, to change some behaviours around those silos. There's a companion piece of work that my colleague Chris Hipkins is doing on the State Sector Act, which is the ultimate of siloing arrangements, which is now going to be renamed the Public Sector Act, and actually, again, is going to have a focus on incentivising working together. Credit actually to the last government. They actually began this piece of work, but didn't take it far enough in terms of actually not just saying it's okay to share some of your resources, but we actually want you to do it. And in the budget, we tried to and I tried to reward, in inverted commas, so this is the other end, legislation's one end of the process, budgetary stuff is another end of the process. I tried to reward groups that work together. So one of the great things I've seen, led by another former staff member of the Centre for Sustainable Cities here, Jan Logie, our Under-Secretary, an amazing piece of work on bringing together all of the agencies working on domestic and sexual violence. Never happened before. And here's how you can tell it's never happened before. We have 8 agencies, government agencies, all working together on one plan on how we eliminate domestic and sexual violence. When we went to set it up, there was no name for it. We couldn't find a name. We've called it the joint venture. But we just came up with that name because in the system, there was no name to describe 8 government agencies all working towards one goal. That might be a hint of the problem that we've got. So the joint venture is doing some amazing work. So it's got police, and it's got social development, it's got justice, it's got the Ministry for Women. It has a parallel NGO body that works alongside it. It's hard work. It's slow work because we're having to undo 30 years of thinking the same way. But we can do it, and it's going to fundamentally mean we will make change there. So we've done that in that particular area. There are other examples of that, particularly in mental health and corrections, and the work we're even doing on sustainable land use, where we're bringing, I think is Hugh here? Campbell's here? Yes, there is. You know, the work that we're doing on sustainable land use is actually a program developed by 5 different government agencies. The missing link is more involvement with academics and the NGO community to try and drive that through, but that's what we're trying to do. So those are the core features of the wellbeing budget. Better and different measures of success that more widely reflect the values of New Zealanders, making sure that we're using evidence at every stage of the process, at investment level, monitoring all the way through, and breaking down those silos to actually get people to focus on where we go. So my final point is the story that I thought I'd tell, which is that I have a much more important portfolio, Eon will definitely agree with this, than finance, and that is as Minister of Sport and Recreation. And as part of the budget process, I drove something that substantively I wanted to have happen, but I also wanted the process to happen. And that is that in the budget, there is a program called Healthy Active Learning that is a joint project between Sport New Zealand, the Ministry of Health, and the Ministry of Education. The first thing about that is that Sport New Zealand, because it's a Crown entity, not a government ministry or department, has never ever been invited to sit in with the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Education to co-design something, because they're a Crown entity. They're not the same as a policy agency. So we brought them all together and we came up with a project. It looks a lot like Healthy Eating, Healthy Action. The Loop. So, once upon a time, Jim Mann and I used to march down to the Ministry of Health and talk to them about a program called Healthy Eating, Healthy Action, and how we might help them with that and help them with the evaluation of all of that. It's a little bit different, actually, because it does involve those agencies, but its philosophy is the same, that actually, if we want to improve outcomes, well-being outcomes in terms of nutrition, physical well-being outcomes, we need to use nutrition, physical activity, physical literacy, to use the modern term about that. And that comes from all of those agencies working together. So they're happy to talk to anyone who wants to about the program and how it's going to roll out, but it does draw together nutrition, physical activity, physical literacy into one program, delivered to begin with in a range of schools and then hopefully out to everybody over time. So in the end, good ideas might go to sleep for a while, but they come back. But it is about bringing those agencies together, evidence-based, and I brought it with me if anyone wants to read. There's an evidence-based document that lies behind it that actually which is every budget bid now has to do, which describes how it supports those wellbeing outcomes and how it does the things in there. So I applaud you for working in the sector that you do. I applaud you for believing in evidence, and I encourage you to reach out across disciplines to be able to support this kind of wellbeing agenda if you believe in it too. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa.